Hey guys, welcome back to the Lit Mag Lab podcast. I'm Jazz Marie, aka Vevna Forrow. So, previously on the podcast, I was going over a fairly new submission intake system for editors, right? Even submitters to check out. It is called Galley, Galley. Just a reminder, you can see my screen, what I'm sharing out on YouTube. Apple also has video now. This is plugged into a couple different places, Substack even, and my articles. And yeah, so totally, whichever platform works best for you. I also share these on Spotify, but most have been watching these out on YouTube, it looks like. So yeah, just want to give some quick updates before I cover the question of the day, since it's been a little bit of a break since I've done any new episodes. In terms of my guidebook, so Lit Magnation, I did take some time to do a large print text edition of it. So that means I bumped up the font size to improve the readability of it because I know the small text version definitely was harder on the eyes. Now, you just want to be careful. This just happened yesterday. So, the orders that came in were fine. They were for the large text edition. I'm not sure why they did this on Amazon. So just be mindful, like when you go, I put a ticket in to address this, but when you go to order it, just make sure that it's stating the large text edition and it's the one from 2026, not the one from, yeah, earlier. So I'm not sure why it's suddenly linked up to the other small text edition. I'm not sure why. But the orders that came in the other day were all for the large text edition. So just make sure, when you go to order it that it has this, right, in it and you're looking at the correct one that's 24.99, right? And the hardcover, right? So it's one from June 2nd, 2026. And yeah, I had actually went back and added an ISBN to the large text print edition, and that's why I think it had that brief hiccup there. But yeah, everyone, that ordered this month got the large text print edition. Just be mindful. Like just yesterday this happened, so I'm sure it'll be addressed soon, but just make sure you order the one with the correct subtitle in there and the dimensions right. So that will be the larger edition, and it's 250 pages for that one. So, yeah, just make sure, when you go to order the guidebook, right, that it's the larger text print edition. And that would be, what you see here on my screen, right? It's the 6x9 one, June 2nd, 2026, 250 pages. It has all my notes in it from September 2022 to June 10th ish, of 2026. So, yeah, I just, updated it because some things changed, like Draft to Digital, a few other platforms. It's not just for editors, but it's like 60/40, I'd say, 60% for founding editors and publishers. And then it also talks about my experience as a submitter, like all the ups and downs and things I went through the past, couple of years, running a lit mag, how to start your own, things to remember, platforms and tools to consider in, present day. Obviously, some of the platforms are going to change over the next couple of years, but I think more than ever, it's beneficial to share, experiences and things we went through, as a founding editor, right? So you can get it as a Kindle ebook, you can get it in paperback, just, or hardcover. Just make sure it says larger text print edition. There's another edition floating around out there that is the small text version and it doesn't have, a subtitle on it. So I put a ticket in to fix the linkage because, yeah. Anyways, um, yeah. In regards to the series, I want to again cover a question of the day. And I have, with my own Lit Mag journal, for those of you where I run Dippity Lit Mag, right? I've temporarily restructured my Lit Mag just to address some things solo personally. And yeah, so I'm running it solo right now. And my team again was super awesome, but I just need some time to figure out some things. Like I have some, still some ongoing family health events, some other things, that I'll maybe talk about on a different episode. I use this as also a diary and covering, my experiences. Yeah. So, my Lit Mag and journal, it's not on a hiatus or anything like that. I'm just like changing the structure of it for just this year, temporarily at least. I'd like to go back to having a team structure and stuff in the future. I'm hoping to, once I get some things figured out. So I'm just seeing, how things go and everything, right? So yeah, anyways, I mentioned that too in my guidebook and some of the things I, was going through personally, and yeah, so it's an honest guidebook, and I think I got a review on it, so thank you. I think It was the founding editor of After Dinner Conversation, and I covered an episode on them too. So that's great, that they found it really useful and helpful. And yeah, so eventually they'll link up the review, to this. I'm not sure what happened with the linkage. There's an issue, so they'll fix it though. Most important thing is I got it. I finished it, so it definitely took me some time. So definitely check it out. If you want a PDF version of this, totally pick it up through my Patreon. I started a Patreon, guys, too. So if you want to support my series and what I'm doing, there's a $3 a month option. There are different tiers and levels. I know Substack starts at $5, for most places, not mine per se, but it's less expensive than Substack to support, right? If you want to buy this guidebook as a PDF, you can pick it up for $15. The small text edition is cheaper than the large text edition because it's the small text version is like a Bible text font, so it's harder to read. That's why the price differences, and it was printing from the UK. Yeah, the UK printers predominantly, so that's why. Anyways, so you can grab this and check it out if you'd like. And yeah, so we'll get to the question of the day here in just a minute. I want to clarify one more thing. I promise, just one more thing, since it's been a while since I've posted any episodes. So I was listening back and I noticed when, sometimes, when you have physical pain, you get brain fog, right? And just know that, in some past episodes, when I said, 2017, I actually meant 2018. And when I said, perhaps 2019, I meant 2020, just regarding personal events. I like to be as accurate as possible. Perhaps it doesn't matter to anyone, but sometimes when I was talking, I was like either a year behind or a year ahead. It wasn't the sense of losing track of time. It's just that, sometimes you get brain fog when you're in pain. And yeah, so unless I'm reading off a year, on my screen, or, you know, something I've triple checked, in terms of years, things like that, then perhaps, yeah, it happens sometimes. So just so you guys know that, because I think it happened in like maybe it was episode one or some of the other episodes, and I never really took the time to state that. So yeah. Anyways, now let's get to the question of the day. Yeah, how about it? So I'm going to pull it up here and read it off for you guys. There's a question. So yeah, this was a comment off of episode 6. Totally listen back to that if you're curious what that episode was about. But beneath that was a comment from Liana Meyer, who stated, "I've launched my first ever lit mag, The Good Companion, a place for people and their lives with pets." And it states that the first issue, has reasons on why it was started and a few other pieces. And yeah, and it's going to focus on, it looks like, service and therapy issues, and is going to be based on themes, after that. So yeah, that's awesome. Congrats on that. I personally really love pets, and most of you guys know that I absolutely love chihuahuas. My family, across my life, had chihuahuas, and I started off with pet fish though, for sure. But yeah, that's a really cool, focus. Absolutely, I would have to say, because I can't think of any other lit mags really doing that, so I think that's really great. Yeah, so I'll circle back and check out The Good Companion sometime, but I want to get to Liana's question here. So it states here, I'll phrase it this way, reword it slightly, but Liana was asking, at what point will I be legitimate enough to qualify for such outlets? To list, their lit mag and journal and directories, to land on curation sites, on Substack and elsewhere. And yeah, and reaching out to places, related to the themes that will be covered, yeah. So in terms of, what makes a lit mag or journal deemed as legitimate or ready to be placed on directories, at what point in time, my response to that would be, the earlier the better, absolutely. The first place I think I was listed on, was Chill Subs, and Chill Subs doesn't have any really rigid requirements to be listed on there, per se, as of 2026 to date, or even when they started. They have this, as you can see on my screen, right? Suggest a listing, if you're watching the video podcast channels, right? So it says, suggest a listing in the upper right here, right? If we click on suggest listing, you'll see it states here, are you the editor of this magazine, right? So, if you're a first time editor, right, yeah, you could, fill that out. And then submitters, other people, right, can make suggested listings. I've made suggested listings in the past, just for the purpose of showing, some of the fields on directories and talking through it a little bit. Let's take a look at it, right? Again, yeah, so this looks different from when like I first filled out a little bit listing. I think, I think Chill Subs also made some new filtering UI updates, right, and stuff. But yeah, you can see they just require like your logo, your cover, right, image, right, that sort of represents, your lit mag, your journal, an issue cover, key visual, and the magazine name, website link, your magazine name URL, and yeah, the description, for your browse card, right, 250 characters about your magazine, up to 5,000 characters, right? The masthead, who's running it, who's on the team, choose the type of magazine, right? You know, are you creative, academic, trade, consumer, or journalism? Link to guidelines, submission method, and submission method address. And from there, once you get a listing, on there, right, then, as an editor, right, of your Lit Mag Journal, right, you can, fill in other things, calls, and, keep that updated, right? Because traffic does absolutely, a lot of traffic goes through Chill Subs. Others can bookmark you, discover you, right? The whole thing about directories getting listed in them, right, is to help discoverability. So yeah, the moment you launch, get your guidelines up, your website, who's running it, visible masthead, all of that, your URLs, right, and submission intake method, all of that, right, in you have all of that down, right? Yeah, you could apply for a Chill Subs listing. Now, every directory is a little bit different. There are similarities between directories in terms of like their criteria and requirements of what they're looking for. An example of this would be, let's go out to I'll come back and talk about Chill Subs in a little bit, but let's go out to poets and writers. Now, because you're seeing ads on my screen, just again, just being aware, none of these are sponsored episodes, but I have to sometimes mark some episodes on some platforms. I post this as differently because it detects it as that, I don't know, some buggy thing there. But yeah, anyways, poets and writers is a directory. Now I just have my own like press on listed on poets and writers, and I don't have Dippity Lit Mag, my own literary magazine, on here, to date. Now I did apply about a little over a year ago or two almost, and they had came back and said, actually you should apply for this other type of magazine or something. It was based on the circulation or the distribution of your magazine. So they had different fields or something that I had to reapply to. I never ended up reapplying, and it sort of just dropped off. So I ended up just doing Dippity Press instead. But that's something I could do, if I wanted to. But anyways, so they have, a method here, right? If you type poets and writers, listings of literary magazines, right, you'll come across this page, right? And, pw.org/literary underscore magazines. And I have all these directories, by the way, or the ones I'm aware of, right, in my guidebook. Again, if you're not a fan of audio or things like that. Um, yeah, and I made an article post not too long ago about directories. But so you can see they have FAQ and criteria. Let's click on that. So you'll see here, right, they have questions here, right? So um, I'm going to skip over this stuff here. So here we go, right? What criteria must a magazine meet to be included in the Poets and Writers database, right? So again, each database directory has different requirements. I'm quoting this off their site, right? So Poets and Writers includes magazines and journals that meet generally accepted standards for professionalism in literary publishing and that are relevant to writers of poetry and literary prose, the group they primarily serve. All magazines are accepted at their editorial discretion, and approval is based on the following criteria. So magazines must primarily publish poetry and or literary prose, fiction, and creative nonfiction. They do consider magazines that publish genre fiction, translation, and YA, but not those that publish primarily journalism, scholarly articles, and or children's literature. Magazines must have an open submission process. Submissions may be open to only specific audiences. And they do consider magazines that do not regularly accept unsolicited submissions and accept queries or pitches. Magazines must exhibit careful editing. Those that publish everything they receive do not qualify, and be free of excessive typographical typographical and production errors. Magazines must prove an established track record by having published at least 2 issues or a comparable level of content and be actively publishing. An archive of past issues should include, at a minimum, a list of contributors or table of contents. And yeah, so again, magazines must have an editorial process in place. And if they have a website, list the submission guidelines, visible on the website, right? Everything, editorial staff, contact information. Magazines must not publish their own editors exclusively or excessively, and magazines must not require writers to purchase a subscription in order to submit and or publish their work. Print magazines must have a circulation greater than 100. Online magazines that use blog software to publish must distinguish themselves from personal blogs by meeting all criteria outlined on the right there, yeah, that they have listed. And yeah, and so, yeah, they have things for magazines that have no online presence or not at all, instructions there as well. But yeah, that is a good example of like things to think about, again, of like criteria and things before you apply. Make sure you're checking off everything on the list. Now, Duotrope is another directory, right? They have different listing criteria. Now, again, some similarities there, right? You just want to read it carefully. I'm not going to read off all of the criteria. You can see it on my screen. You can go out to this, right? Listing criteria for publishing projects, journals, magazines, anthologies, contests, and presses. So, information on how to request listings at the bottom of the page, right? And yeah, so you can just, click on request a new listing, right? They'll ask for, these fields, right? Your name, email address, qualification, publication history, right? Product's title, website, and, other things. They'll go out, the Duotrope team will go out and check your website guidelines. Same thing with poets and writers. Now, chill subs, I'm not sure on, the process, that they go through after you submit it. I'm not fully aware to date. And yeah, keep in mind, guys, I'm going to reiterate this. It came up also on Litmag News, run by Becky, and also over on chill subs, right? That this was mentioned, right? So, and I also added notes in some articles and guides, right? So just because you are listed on a directory or database like say chill subs, that doesn't mean you're vetted, or that doesn't mean you're a verified litmag, right? Don't associate chill subs with like a verified blue check mark or anything like that to date. Don't associate like that. It's not like that. Chill subs is more so, like I said, right? Like consider it like the Yelp for lit mags, journals, and presses. There are totally some presses listed on Yelp, guys, that have reviews, but it's not I think appropriate, because it's more so like Yelp's for like physical locations, right, and stuff like that, right? Let's click on Rind and Root as an example, right? What's really great about chill subs, again, is they have a new reviews feature, right? This is for if you're on the better right plan that they have, that you can leave reviews and stuff, but you can have a rating still, and stuff, so that's great. That's what's really cool about chill subs, and being in this directory, right? Again, there's no like, they don't have a lot of rigid requirements around that to date. With chill subs is more so others in the community are reporting things, leaving ratings and reviews. Yeah, so again, so duotropes, criteria is going to be different from others, so yeah, I would say, releasing your first issue is absolutely but an okay point to, you know, be listed on chill subs, to get listed in, some of the other directories and places out there, right? Submission Grinder, right? They have, suggest a market right under the contact section. Things can change with websites, but you can see, and, suggested listing, typically, if others have, submitters may suggest a listing, and you make sure details are correct. If you ever see someone made a suggested listing for your publication or directory or space, right? And chill sub, same thing. Like if someone suggests a listing, an editor can claim that listing, if it hasn't been claimed, right, by the editor, right, and go in and maintain it. But yeah, so it's not like there's every single directory or place has very rigid criteria, but some do have things that they absolutely do look for, that would disqualify you. Now, you know I think, if you're at a point of demonstrating, right, what a lot of places look for, not just directories or not just, places that do curation and stuff, is consistency, right? Now, in my guidebook, I cover, right, the difference between a good and stellar lit mag and a bad one, or one that might fail or be fraudulent or exhibit scammy and fishy behavior, right? That would be bad, right? So one thing that makes a really great lit mag journal is consistency and being active, right? Now, life events happen, so that's okay. But the most important thing is to be transparent and clear and communicative when those things happen. Something I recently did was put just a pop up, to communicate statuses. For some, pop-ups can be annoying, but I think it helps to have something there visible, in more than one place for others, at least one place for others to be aware of, like, what's going on with the publication, besides seeing have any new pieces been published, right? It's important that your publication has activity, right? Because then, like, Duotrope, right, checks that, does, annual checks, and things like that. With chill subs, it's more so like community members, right, of the litmag community, others, submitters, right, things like that, can report, if a publication even Duotrope and other places have this, right, a publication perhaps has become defunct or no longer exists, or has closed, right. Yeah, so yeah, you know it's again, with Dippity Litmag, for example, right? I had intended to release 2 issues a year, right? But that didn't end up happening, right? I had to sort of adjust it to, for now, just an annual issue. But ideally, I would love to release 3 or 4 issues a year, and have a consistent number. Consistency is important, but a lot. I've seen some publications, drop down to doing one annual anthology, one annual issue, and that's okay. Only do what you can, as I stated in my guidebook, right? But to keep in mind, like, if you're going to join the community of literary magazines and presses, right, and they have some contest, right, for lit magazine journals and presses, right, to partake in, members get a discount on entries and stuff, I recall, right? There's different contests they hold, right? The Firecracker Award, the Constellation Award, are different, right? Yeah, the Firecracker Award, right? So I think for some of the events, with CLMP, and if you're not familiar with CLMP, you can listen back to episode 82, and I cover it in another one too. But the video episode was that one, 82, and I think it may have been 16 too, the first time I talked about CLMP. So yeah, 16 and 82, you can, check out those episodes on CLMP. But the thing about CLMP with some of their contests, not all of them, I can't remember off the top of my head all the guidelines, but I recall, right, that for one of the contests, it says you have to have a minimum of 2 issues, or the award event, I should say, for Lit Magazine Journal Presses, a minimum of 2 releases a year. So that's something to think about. Now, to join CLMP, right, they have, right, the eligibility and guidelines here, right? And, if your budget's under 50,000, right, your annual dues are $125 a year, and that doesn't include your, like, let's say you get a submission management system, that doesn't include your bill for that, right? For submittable, right, it's like, the lowest is like $29 a month, right? Subfolio is about, $29 a month. If you're without the membership, like with Subfolio, right, it's like, $34, I think, to date. um and something I did recently, with CLMP, and I'll share in, again, a bit. And yeah, so just keep in mind, just because you're not part of the CLMP membership, the Community Literary Magazine Presses, that doesn't mean you're not a legitimate lit mag journal press, right? No one, there's no, as I said in my guidebook, there's no lit mag police or anything like that. But there are good and bad lit magazine journals and presses out there, right? There are some doing fishy things that have unusually high fees, and some questionable, right, calls, and some practices that they have going on, just weird setups, right, that never, I'm sure with enough, community support around something, if enough people report it to, let's say one happens to be a member of CLMP, right? If enough people report it, right, then obviously it would be, I would hope it would be addressed, right, with any fishy behavior that a publication has. But anyways, just because you're not a member of CLMP doesn't mean you're not a legitimate Lit Mag Journal Press. It's a additional benefit to become a member of CLMP, and it's more of a want, not absolutely a need. You don't need it to remain a Lit Mag Journal Press or publisher in the world, right? I recently paused my CLMP membership, not because I didn't want it, but I just didn't, for others, maybe 125 bucks, anything under 200 bucks isn't a lot of money. But, if things are tight, let's say you're out of work or stuff like that, then that's a lot of money, and it could go to other bills and other things that you have, right? And yeah, so I just paused it for right now, because, personally, it wasn't like I, wouldn't be able to run my Lit Mag Journal Press without it. Absolutely, joining the CLMP, membership and everything was beneficial, right? A lot of knowledge exchanges happen there. You can be aware of plagiarists. You can really, again, as I stated, right, really connect with other founding editors through there, and they have meetups and events and things. So it's a great, membership. So I would say I do like CLMP. I do love it. It's not something I absolutely need right now. It's not something you absolutely need from the get go, but it can be helpful if you're thinking about using Submittable per se, right, then you absolutely do need the CLMP membership, because without it, it's like 10,000 bucks, right? Submittable, right, is with the membership, it's like as low as $29 a month with Submittable. But there are other, like Submit with Subfolio, right? And I have to make some platforms aware that I paused our membership rate because our bill changes slightly, but not by much, without the CLMP membership, right? We don't get discounts and stuff like that, but it's not too bad still. Had I been on Submittable, no way I could pause the CLMP membership because you need that, right, to get that great discount with Submittable. But I really love Subfolio again, and even Dapple has some, discounts and stuff, and it's not too bad. Some of the other submission man systems I discussed on this podcast, Ola, right, and stuff, very, very reasonable prices, if you need to get a submission man system. But a lot of places function on email. It's not that efficient when you're dealing with a lot of submissions, though, right? And I'm someone who likes tagging and organizing things again. Anyways, so, you know, um, yeah, so I would say, apply as early as possible, and but you absolutely, I think it is a good idea to get issue one out at least, when you have two issues out, that is a really good place to, start applying to places. Absolutely, when you can show or exhibit consistency in your releases. So absolutely, chill subs, duotrope, right? Those are two great places to, and submission grinder. And another one would be new pages, right? So if we go to about, right? So if we go to more about, get listed on new pages, right? It's going to have the listing request area here, and they have a view FAQ, right? And everything right on it. So read that before you submit, absolutely. And it'll state outright what they're looking for. How do you get your magazine listed on new pages, right? And one of the most important things is a stated and regular publication cycle, right? Consistency, right? That's what others really look for, right? When you're applying to places, right? Regardless if it's a new pages or a directory place, consistency, So I've seen quite a few places mention, a minimum of 2 releases a year, but there are absolutely some places that don't state that at all, more than ever, having a very professional publication, very clean, organized, visible guidelines, you're not, a vanity press or anything like that, right? Yeah, and you're very transparent about everything. If there's submission fees, right, they're minimal, right? They're reasonable. They're not like astronomical. But, there's been some glaring things, right? Lit Mag News has pointed out with some publications that are, you know, um, part of certain things, right, in the world that exists for Lit Mag's Journal Presses. Could be memberships and stuff like that. But, anyways, yeah, so you just want to read the guidelines carefully for every directory place. Absolutely, you should demonstrate that you are able to successfully release issues, to have a regular publication schedule, right, every month, to roll out publications, maybe they're individual pieces. If they're issues, then are they released every quarter? Are they released, do you release two issues a year? Do you release four issues a year? How many issues are you releasing? Is and yeah, and stick to it. If you need to adjust things, absolutely, that's okay. It just helps to be as many directories as possible, right? So others can discover you, right? A lot of traffic goes through, right? Chill subs, and this is I think a fairly is Ryan. I think Ryan DeRoot is yeah, fairly new publication, 2026. So that's why they don't have that many bookmarks yet. So that was just one I clicked on. I haven't looked at their publication or anything yet, but yeah. So absolutely, a good place to start is chill subs, Duotrope, and yeah, poets and writers, new pages, and some of the other ones out there. They do have some requirements, and yeah, so CMP has a directory, right? They accept suggestions, so it's not like you're paying these directories to get listed in them, right? I would feel uncomfortable if lit mags and journals had to start paying directories to be listed in them, so it's not the case here. It's more so you just have to make sure you meet the minimum requirements, right? Their criteria and everything. Yeah, that's basically it. If you want to become a member of CLMP, by all means, right? The cool thing about CLMP, they have, not just the directory of publishers, right? And again, others can make suggested listings, but you can have, for members, right, of CLMP, right? There's a call area, right? You could plug in calls, right? The more places you're plugged into, right, the better, right? When you have calls and, open windows, right? I remember, when we used to be a member of CLMP, right? Others were like, hey, we found your call through CMP, so that's cool. They do get a significant amount of traffic, but you don't absolutely need the CMP membership, right, to get placed in directories other places at all. It does help, to say you're a member of CLMP, right? You get discounts. You can put that on your website, that you're a member of CLMP. CLMP does, check, when you apply to them, right? And you have the membership when they give you the okay and you pay the membership fee and all of that, right? So, you want to make sure you have a domain. You don't have, any, you know, found the founding editors shouldn't have their work displayed right on the site. You should focus solely on the publication, right? And the writers and artists you're featuring, or, whatever your publication focuses on. And yeah, so I would say be the thing to be careful about in terms of directories, and and yeah, so that's basically it. Again, Chill Subs doesn't have a fee or anything like that. None of these places really have fees for you to join them. CMP has, in terms of a directory listing and things like that. So, there's no fees for, so yeah, to maintain a listing, as Duotrope has here, just as I clicked on this page back again, to maintain a listing of Duotrope, right, you must publish regularly and must have signs of recent publication on the official website you have, right? And, for those that list their publication frequently, quarterly, monthly, etc., they expect that you maintain that schedule within reason, right? So my publication, for example, Dippy Lit Mag, right, published monthly, right, online typically, and yeah, and then I used to strive for two annual issues a year, but that's not going to be possible. It looks like just with things that I'm dealing with personally, so I'm striving for just one annual issue. I know it's probably going to disqualify me from things, but for right now, that's how it's going to be. Um, and if things change ever, totally, it's okay for you to restructure Lit Matter Journal, right? There's no one saying you can't. It's just like if you don't have consistency there, if you keep changing things, right? That may not be beneficial to you, obviously, right? It's good to stick to a schedule and to maintain it, right? I would say just like our print schedule is changing at Dippity, that's all. Regularly, publish online, and do features and publications, through not just through our website. And yeah, so if I hop back over to Duotrope, right, something that I'll quote off of here, right, on their listing criteria page. So to maintain a listing with Duotrope, right, you must publish regularly and must have signs of recent publication on your official website. And yeah, for those that list their publication frequency, for example, quarterly, monthly, etc., right, they expect the publisher to maintain that schedule within reason, right? For book publishers and publications with an unspecified frequency, they expect publication at least once a year. Projects that do not meet these guidelines will be disqualified or believed defunct. For standalone anthologies, they require publication within 2 years of posting the call for submissions. Projects that don't reach fruition within 2 years will be disqualified. So, yeah, and you must have an established publication history, right? So they must have published their first issue or book at least 6 months ago. So yeah, you can see there that's the criteria for duotrope, right? So yeah, um, you just want to, get yourself established, right, in the first few months. So yeah, of duotrope, they're saying at least 6 months ago. So once you establish your publication history, once you can demonstrate you have publication consistency, right? Yeah, totally. That's when you can really start applying to these places. For duotrope, right, they're saying, must have published their first issue of book at least 6 months ago. So, again, there's different criteria for some of these directories, but not all of them. Again, chill subs would be a great place to start first to get a listing in there because that's one that comes up in a lot of search results when others are looking for lit magazine journals, right? They can come across that, not just your magazine's website, or publications you've posted, right? Or issues you released, in search results. So yeah, and they do have, fledgling listing of availability. Thing Duotrope does have, right, is fledgling listings. So, if you have not yet published, a first issue book and your website's not hosted through a free service, etc., right, they have the right to refuse your listing, right, until you have released, something. If the first issue book was published less than 6 months ago, right? Something that Duotrope does do, right? They put like a fledgling status or different banners you may see, right? So yeah, just follow their instructions, how to request the listing, follow their advice pages and stuff and policies. It's not hard at all. So, don't feel like you have to wait 6 months, but definitely a good idea to establish, your publication, online to demonstrate, the schedule you have. Are you publishing, pieces monthly? Are you publishing every other month? Are you releasing, digital, solely digital issues annually, or digital and print, annually? Are you doing 1 to 2 a year? Are you doing just one a year? Are you doing 2 issues a year? Um, for again, some award contests for some other directories, I've seen like a minimum of 2 releases a year. So that's not the case for all these though. So don't feel like you have to do that. But absolutely, consistency, being active, that's important, right? Absolutely. And if you're not going to be able to follow through with that, like you just do it when you can, then just be transparent about that. Like, just note you publish as many as you can each month, but just note that that's not going to fly with some directories and stuff and places. They're not going to be really, they could deny you, if you're just like not being consistent enough and things aren't organized and not displayed in a professional manner, right? They have the right to refuse a listing, for you, right? All these places do, right? If anything, along the lines of that, you're not maintaining professionalism, and things are going, haywire at your publication essentially, or any scammy fishy behavior that others report and stuff like that, totally that is grounds for removal, right? Or inactivity, right? Obviously is a common thing that happens with lit magazine journals and presses that just disappear or vanish, suddenly, without any notice. So just keep that in mind. So, absolutely, you know, um, I wouldn't say apply the same day you create your website or anything. Take some time to really make sure your guidelines are in order. You've published pieces. You have a schedule that you feel you can maintain in the first year. And if the first year you need to change, after the first year, if you need to change things, just make sure your website's updated, your schedule's updated, and everything. That's all you got to do, right? Um, you know, just make sure you can fulfill what you say you're going to do, and be transparent and communicate when life events happen. If things are going to be slower than usual, or if the release is carrying over past the expected time, that can happen sometimes, and try to get back on track. That's all you got to do. So yeah, In terms of, the question about Substack, right? So I'm not on Substack right now or anything like that. But I would say there absolutely, again, are places or publisher. There are absolutely some publications on Substack. Others who do curated lists. Obviously, we're all aware of Chill Subs and the Sub Club, right? Those lists and a lot of others maintain lists and do curation and feature publications and things of that nature, right? Now, to have others be aware of your publication on Substack or certain platforms, right? It's perhaps the best answer to that one for Substack particularly is to you know be in, to engage, right? To engage with others on Substack, right? To make them aware that your publication exists, and that could be as simple as recommendate giving a recommendation, to maybe one you follow or really love, and they'll probably see that. A lot of places have that switched on. I think it's a setting maybe or not. I can't remember if it is, but anyways, a lot of people are so yeah, a lot of people do see their recommendation list or who's giving a recommendation to them, so they're bound to seeing that. There's a great chance they'll probably see that. Another great way is, if they posted something, let's say it's a curated list or something of that nature, you could drop a comment, say, wow, this list is really awesome. I really love it. Something as simple as that would perhaps bring eyes over to maybe they'll check out your publication or others may, engaging in the comment section, restacking, leaving a recommendation. A great ways to engage with others and show support to one another in the community. That's all. If you're gonna comment, don't be a marketer per se. I wouldn't say it's a great place to say, leave a comment that is relevant to what they're posting. Say like awesome list, I really love this or something like that. um I'm okay, like if past contributors and stuff in my own publication or in a Substack or somewhere, like, hey, I just released this book or something like that with our publication. So yeah, just be mindful about that. Don't be spammy on Substack or anything like that. When you're engaging with others, don't bombard others with messages and things of that nature. But it doesn't hurt to give others a recommendation, to even give places a shout out, right? Let's say some things I've done totally said, like, hey guys, check out these 5 places. I really love these places, tag them in there. If you do a tag linkage, right, in Substack, right, they're bound to get a notification on that and to maybe come across it, unless they have notifications turned off or something, or their settings, I don't know. But yeah, it helps to engage with others on Substack, particularly if you're talking about that. And yeah, I would say, starting out, just try to get your the footing right off with your publication. I didn't start reaching out to magazine subscription platforms and spaces like those of nature, right, until about issue 4 or so. you know like some of the places I talked about when I was dealing with digital subscription platforms, because they absolutely do need to see, your release consistency. They're like, oh, you release 2 issues a year, and if you need to change that to, again, by any means, that's okay. But they like to see consistency. They like to, places like that, right? Now, some places will look at, unfortunately, I'm not a numbers person. I don't like the whole aspect of numbers and stuff, but unfortunately, it's something we deal with in life. Um, some places absolutely, may, again, this is a common comment I got, may not find your content popular. They may reject it, right? They have the right to. And yeah, you just got to keep trying. If your publication takes off or gains a lot of traction, right? Obviously, others will come to you, right? They'll reach out to you, right? But be careful, right? There's a lot of scams, there's a lot of fishy things we get in our inboxes as founding editors, so you want to be very careful about things like that. But absolutely, some may look at your followers, the number of subscribers you have, and determine it from there. Just looking off of that. And yeah, or if it doesn't, there are some international places, international run subscription places I got declined from, and some places absolutely did accept us, and some, there are very few fee free like digital subscription platforms. There's only like what, like 3 to 4 in existence that I'm aware of to date. There are probably others out there, and probably more will be created in the future, but just like the ones I'm aware of with like no upfront fees, and things of that nature. Um, and actually, yeah, there's like some that do connective libraries, right? I covered some on this podcast. And so yeah, if you're when you're dealing with digital subscription platforms, or some of them again have no upfront fees, or some and take a percentage of your sales, or some have upfront fees. And the criteria they have is completely different from like what directories have. Again, everyone's criteria and stuff has some similarities, but some differences, absolutely. So you want to read carefully. But yeah, absolutely. Good places to start, to get listed in Chill Subs, Duotrope again, and you can go from there, and move on to others. Submission Grinder, I don't believe they have any real criteria or anything I can think of, or rigid requirements or anything of that nature. So you just want to be mindful about that. Yeah, I'll probably circle back to poets and writers if I can, or at some point in time. I have a listing in there for just our press, Dippity, but I haven't circled back to that because I was restructuring things, and seeing things with my own lit mag journal. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question. And yeah, so when you feel like you've solidified, your schedule, and you've released your first issue, so that's great. So that's a great way to. So yeah, once you release your first issue, totally, you could apply to some of the directories, not all, perhaps. Again, Duotrope again would probably mark you as a fledgling listing if they approve you, or they may tell you like, hey, reapply at a later date, or maybe something's missing. And they may ask you to, hey, we couldn't find this, or sometimes there were times where, like, for instance, when I started Did We Press Up Later, it's like I had to not just have the guidelines in right submittable, right back when we were using submittable, I had to also have the guidelines visible on our website for our press as well, right? Because I just had solely at the time our litmag right guidelines, things like that, right? So whenever you're applying to listing, just make sure you have all your ducks in a row, right? That saying. I don't know, there are other sayings for that, but yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Making sure you have, URLs for your guidelines, your site. Some publications do just live off of Substack. Whether they get their own domain, that's really up to you. But it shouldn't be like your own name, right, for your publication or anything like that. Like, I had converted my several reiterations of the website back to original design of Dippity, right? I had initially started, off converted my author pen name site to the Litmag site, but then like CMP was like, it'd be better you get your own domain, to be able to get on with the membership, right? And to go forward with it. And just clean off all the stuff tied to my pen name, and yeah, so I'd done about like 4 revisions of our site, and the layout, and switching layouts, and I think it finally got to a point where I'm happy with it, guys. So who knows, it may change again. There are still some things I really would love to change about the site and make it more engaging, absolutely, with my own lit mag, but maybe down the road for sure. So yeah, so there's no one out there to per se give you your stamp of approval that you've become a Litmag Journal Press and that you're ready per se. Um, the point in time is like when you've solidified, an issue release. That's when you become a Lit Mag and Journal or Press. Your first publication gets out the door, but you have to demonstrate consistency. You have to do that. Absolutely. I know I'm repeating myself, but it is important. Um, you know, um, have a schedule. If you're going to publish monthly, and the volume may vary when you're starting out, right? It may change, after, running it for the first year, right? It's bound to happen. Shifts in submission volume, but eventually, you should be aware of your average submission volume, things of that nature, and be able to gauge what's an appropriate schedule for you to manage personally, whether you have a staff or not, just make sure it's something manageable, even your response time back to others, right? And that it fits your plan for issue releases and everything, right? If you need more breathing room, right, then you may want to do one issue a year. But again, I've seen quite a few places state a minimum of two issue releases a year, for eligibility in some things, and that's more so like award contests and things of that nature that exist out there. And yeah, so that's what a lot of places are looking for. Again, not just directories, but consistency and yeah, um just starting out, it is just important, again, to be transparent about your guidelines, your schedules, have it all visible, right, and stick to it. And if you need to change it, make adjustments to it. Update your website, update all directory listings where things change. Not all directory listings have all that same information plugged in, right? But for the most part, the main things, right? The main things, what type of work your publication accepts and all of that stuff, right? Your URL submission, guidelines where others can find that, right, and stuff of that nature. So yeah, don't feel like you have to wait like a full year to apply to places or anything like that. I would say the earlier the better, but just note that some places outright say, right, they want to see a schedule from you, right? They want to see demonstrated releases of your issues and table of contents, all of that stuff, like visible issues and your masthead, all of that stuff, right? Being transparent and honest and upfront about everything. So yeah, definitely, take some time to poke around some other lit magazine journals listings, on directory sites, and check out their websites and see how they have their guidelines laid out, their, schedules, and see, and just see, and think about your own schedule and what you can do, if you're doing on the side and working full time or something, part time or whatever. Just make sure it fits your schedule and is something manageable for you. That's important. Absolutely. Because if you have inconsistency there, then obviously people aren't gonna really want to, right, submit to you or um, be placed in your publication, right? So yeah, um, that's pretty much it. With asterism books and distribution services, I was talking about digital subscription platforms, but um, distributors, right? Like Asterism. I don't remember what episode I covered Asterism on, but again, Asterism helps, with distribution, and there's an approval process for them. And others could discover you on Asterism, but it's tough to get into Asterism. A lot of places, even with large volumes of issues, have gone declined from asterism. Not everyone's eligible, and they don't accept everyone, right? And there's different reasons for that. They want to see consistency and and things of that nature. But more than that, there are other factors, right? I'm sure they look for. Till today, I'm not really sure, on all the factors and stuff. I've never gotten approved for a distributor or trade distribution for bookstores of that nature. So what some publications do, they go through the Ingram network, or distribute that way, or they just distribute issues from their website or other you know maybe digital magazine platforms that accepted them, or um, there's some digital flip libraries I covered, right, that you could plug in your publication to. Some have a monthly fee, and some have a cap on, at a point of when it's cut off as of being free, monthly fees and stuff of the nature. So if you dig through the podcast, you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of that. But yeah, so episode 63 was Asters and Books. So again, they are a distributor, so they do have a list of publishers they work with, right, and stuff of that nature. The thing about Astrum books, though, when you get a decline from them, right, there's a wait time when you can reapply again, right? Now, I haven't seen any like wait times and stuff with other directories and stuff. I'm not aware that Duotrope has one. So yeah, just read through, again, guidelines carefully and criteria for what these, listing directories are looking for. It'll really help you understand what you need to have on your website and what you should facilitate, on your, through your publication, right? And what others look for, right, is in terms of how your operations are run at your Lit Journal Press, right? And yeah, So yeah. So absolutely, just wanted to share, the places, you could start with first, being early, right? You'd probably, if you get approved, right, they probably do a trip with list you as a fledgling listing, right? Um, if it was less than 6 months ago, right, and they approve you, right? um they may absolutely, I'm sure they probably have told others sometimes, like, hey, maybe, reapply, you know after 6 months or something, or maybe they declined someone because things were missing, and they said, maybe, we couldn't find this on your site, we can't give you listing quite yet until these things are visible, right? I'm sure that happens. Chill subs, again, it's more so on the editor to update the listing and maintain it. And then others, can leave ratings and reviews on listings, right? And yeah, so yeah. And again, CLMP has a directory, right? And, suggestions are accepted from the community, but, that doesn't necessarily mean, again, places have a right to decline others, right, from the directories. And again, they'll look at, right, the professionalism of your lit mag journal press, the organization of it, the consistency, the activity, right? Are you an active publisher or not, right? That's what it comes down to. And yeah, so it shouldn't be at all a problem, starting off, um, absolutely. The more places you're plugged into, again, the better, that's how others are going to discover you. And yeah, chill subs, again, I would start with that, move on to Duotrope, apply. If you just launched your Lit Mag journal and press, make sure, again, just read through, right, their guidelines, make sure you meet the requirements, right? Whether you're eligible or not. Um, New pages, I don't recall. I think I did submit to new pages, like applied for listing, but I don't remember if I ever heard back from them. And maybe I'll circle back to them. So, yeah. But anyways, yeah, new pages, again, has, listing FAQ and requirements. You just want to read through, right? That meet all of the criteria that they're looking for, right? And yeah, so, professional, right, contact address, new pages looking for, and, other things, right? So again, it's going to be a little bit different at each directory place, but there are some similarities, right? So, if you don't get on listed on every single directory in existence, that's not the end of the world. But I would say some key, I would say absolutely, chill subs, duotrope, submission grinder, there's a lot of traffic through there still, CMP's directory, absolutely. If you can get on them, that's great. If you can't, it's not the end of the world, right? Others could still discover you other ways through social media, through your activity on maybe Substack, just because others don't, plug you into their list, doesn't mean you're not a great publication at all, right? Just because you're not in the directories and stuff doesn't mean you don't run a great publication at all, and I'm sure, if you do, right, others would suggest you, right, and, recommend you to maybe be listed in these directories and places too. So, absolutely, it doesn't hurt to apply early to some of the places I mentioned. But, when you're dealing like magazine subscription platforms, when you're dealing with distributors and things of that nature, you definitely wanted to carefully, make sure that you have everything, in order, right? Very professional. I wouldn't apply to those places, digital matter screen subscription places, distribution platforms, if you're expanding a series on a massive scale, to do that, in your first year at all. It's important to build out your series to show consistency, to at least have, your issues out, right? I didn't start doing that until about issue 4 for like magazine subscription platforms and things of that nature. Yeah, but absolutely, there are some that perhaps would take others early that exist out there, right? Maybe they'll ask for, an example of your issues and look at that, right? And consider it from there. But yeah, these directories don't ask for all of that, but mainly they're looking at your website, your schedule, and all of that, and, all of that, and totally, some places may totally disqualify you. So There are some places absolutely that will not accept an email address with, at yahoo.com or whatever, that prefer to see an at, domain name email address like tied to your website. It's not absolutely necessary. I know a lot of lit magazine journals presses have run, a long time without that. But, absolutely some places have forms where they will not accept anything, like Gmail or anything like that, um, with addresses and stuff, But I haven't seen that with directories per se. I think mostly this is just like with new pages. And I don't know if they accept, like like a Yahoo or Gmail, if that's what they're saying here. I'm not sure what that means. But, obviously you could ask them and reach out if you're not sure. But it's not the end of the world if you don't get listed on new pages or, all of these, right? Just try to get listed as many as possible, starting out. Poets and writers is probably one I would, wait until you have, meet all of the requirements, um, because they have circulation requirements, they have other things, right? So that may take time, right? Absolutely. That's probably one you might not be able to apply right away for. And if they decline you, that's not the end of the world, right? At least like, you're not eligible for it right now, but maybe you could circle back to it, right? It's not like they'll permanently ban you from the directory or anything like that. That's only like if you're running a fraudulent lit mag journal press or have fishy operations, right? That directories wouldn't really accept you, or you have a lot of inconsistency there, or an inactive publication, right? Or just have vanished, right? And not to say you can't take a long break, from publication and stuff, but if you're going to do that, just be transparent in what those directories would do, like Duotrope, like Chill Subs. They would just mark your publication as inactive, right? And when start things back up again, that's fine, retain a schedule, a new one if you have to address life events and things of that nature. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. So absolutely, I learned a lot by just like applying to places and reaching. Don't be afraid to reach out to others. I think it is scary. Sometimes when you're interested and maybe reaching out to others, and you may be surprised. By I think in the comment I saw somewhere, right, you were mentioning um Liana had mentioned, right, reaching out to others and tied to the themes and things. So yeah, totally. Others, you may totally not get a response from others, when you're maybe doing issues around certain topics or themes, right? You may not get a response from everyone, and that's okay, um that's fine, when you're working maybe with partnering trying to partner with organizations or other things, I think more than ever it's really important to just exhibit, that your publication has traction around it, right? Like you've published pieces, they can see what your publication is all about, right? And the effort you put behind it, right? So yeah, if you're going to maybe have organizations be part of your publication or get behind a cause, that your publication revolves around, right? Again, doesn't hurt to reach out to places, but you probably won't get a response from every single person, right? Some may just say, I'm not interested at this time. Some may not respond to you at all. And yeah, you just got to keep trying, obviously. But yeah, don't be spammy or anything like that. If someone says no, right, then that's a no. But with directories and things of that nature, right, there are, you can typically, not all directories are going to like decline you or anything like that, but they may tell you to reapply or to wait or to address something, right? But when you're dealing with organizations and partnerships, I'm saying, don't be spammy. Obviously, um, obviously you can, you know exhibit how passionate you are about what you're doing with your publication, maybe give a sample issue or direct them where they can view a sample issue or complimentary issue or something. Have it transparent about like the work behind your publication, and I think it's a good idea to reach out to places once you've established right footing, right? Um, it's not good to reach out to places too early, right? like organizations, something of that nature, until you've established, right, your series, and can demonstrate what it's all about, can really showcase what it's all about, right? So I think two issues in is not too bad, but I think I felt more comfortable reaching out to places when I was four issues in, and got the formatting down. But I restructured things, just based on what different direction I wanted to take things in personally with my own publication. So doesn't hurt to reach out to places to start those conversations, and yeah, in terms of like organizations, partnerships, and things of that nature, and yeah, but definitely it looks better when you've established your series and have grown it, right, quite a bit, right? I think so, absolutely. um yeah, so when I got around to issue 4, that's when I started really contacting others a little bit further, like more so of digital magazine subscriptions, distributors, and things of that nature, because I was curious like how others would get into places. And some places outright told me specific things why we were declined, like our series wasn't large enough. And some outright said, it probably won't be popular and things like that. So that may happen, sometimes that's okay. But or may not be a right fit for someone, or a partnership or something of that nature, or distribution or whatever it may be, and that's okay. I would say you're bound to come across, in terms of like reaching out to places and stuff, or getting noticed by others, right? I think the most important thing is to be engaging, right, with others, to on Substack, for instance, right? Even just posting notes, right? I think it's amazing how others can reach others, right? Obviously, even with like, Substack, for instance, right? For those who maintain curated lists and things of that nature, right? Others were discovered through notes, right? I think again, others have said post through 2, 3 notes, or there's some recommended thing that circulated, right? I don't know if it's true or not, but posting 2, 3 notes, a week, or posting notes as much as possible. I don't think you want to be spammy again or anything like that, because like certain platforms flag that, obviously. So again, totally, it helps to, you know, engage, right, in the comment section of various publications, or those who do those curations, right? Then they might see your comment. Again, if you say, hey, this is an awesome list, I really love this, and you could say, add something maybe on the end of that, I run a publication, you know we focus on this and this and that, right? Very brief. Don't be over spammy, or try to sell anything to anyone in the comment section. I don't really like that. But absolutely, showing support to others on Substack, that's really cool. Recommending others, that's how others could maybe come across you, right? That recommendation feature, you could pick up subscribers that way, and maybe someone else comes across your publication that way, or another recommends you back. That whole cycle of recommendations actually helps. I know some people got, 50, 100 subscribers just from the recommendation section, because one place noticed them, yeah. So absolutely, it's a lot of grind, when you're starting off. And yeah, so each directory, again, a little bit different, but some, again, as I said, similarities. So um, don't feel like you have to wait 5 years to apply to these directories, or 2, 3 years at all. In your first year, you could apply to most of these directories, I'd say. Even yeah, new pages, poets and writers. I think those are two I always never really was like, those weren't the top of my list, not because I didn't love them. It's just because they have other requirements in there that, made us ineligible the first time or so, and and restructuring things. So those would be, ones I direct others to first, right? Is what I'm saying. But yeah, they, again, poets and writers, has listings for presses and literary magazines and journals, right? Even if you're not, listed on, for example, poets and writers, you know something that poets and writers do when they get an approved poet profile, right, on their on poets and writers, right, the directory of writers and poets, right. Something that they have, right, is writers put, you have to get a certain number of publications, right, to be listed on poets and writers as an individual, right, poet or writer, right, in the community. And there are certain publications, right, that others can select and pull in, right? So even though we're, Dippy, for example, is not, in visible in the directory, right? Other writers still can add us as a publisher, right? Because, we were an approved, right, publisher to be listed for writers in there, right, under their bio of like public places they've been published in, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean we could never be mentioned on poets and writers at all, right? So just because you're not in a directory, same thing, right? So again, don't feel like you absolutely have to join CLMP, the membership, but it can be beneficial to you. Again, they have a suggested listing for publishers too. And, the membership just has additional benefits, discounts, and, meetups, knowledge exchanges, right? So, you can listen to that episode I did on the podcast. I did 2 episodes on them. And yeah, so I hope that really helps you and answers your question. I again cover or list these directories out in my guidebook and just summarize them. And yeah, but by no means I didn't put all the guidelines and criteria for all of them in my guidebook, because so you know so yeah, again, guidelines and for each database and directory, they're not 100% identical, right? So you just want to be read it over, anytime you see that, that they have an FAQ for criteria, and what they are looking for, for a successful listing, to get approved for a listing, right? In some of these places, not all places, again, and again, just because someone's listed on chill subs or any of these directories doesn't mean that that publication automatically gets, again, a verified status or a green light, right? That everything is a-okay at that publication, right? And that's what's great about chill subs. They have those reviews and ratings, right, that others can leave, right? We don't really see that with other directories and databases to date. So yeah, yeah, so I think, again, it's again, really helps with discoverability, so you want to go for it, right? Something I did, a lot, running my own lit main press, I just applied and said, I'm just going to try, I feel ready, and I'm going to apply. I got these issues out, I'm ready to go. I didn't do it on issue 1 or anything like that, but I did more so reaching out more so to places in issue 4 around that time. But absolutely, I got, in our first, 12 months, I would say, um, of our first 12 months or year or so, right, got listed in the main places, so yeah, absolutely, go for it. You don't have to wait, a bunch of time, but, I think what Duotrope says there, right, that 6 months point, that's not a bad suggested time they have in there, but it's not absolutely required, they're saying, right, because they'll mark you as a fledgling listing if you get approved for listing on their site, right, and platform, right, and in their database. So um yeah, so once you get 2 issues out, right, I'd say that that's a good point, I would say, to yeah, so technically, when so yeah, the whole aspect of being legitimate, I would say it's really demonstrating that you can consistently release issues out, or individual, or if you're doing individual publications, at least, should demonstrate that you publish regularly, that you're a publication that is active, right, and has a schedule, right. There's some publications out there that just publish as many pieces as they can across the year, and maybe do one annual anthology, and that happens too, but absolutely, it is nice to have a set schedule, to have that organization consistency there, and to grow a series out, like releasing regularly every year, that others can look forward to an issue every year, 2 issues a year, 3 to 4 a year, um yeah, so absolutely, it's nice to see that consistency there, right, with any series that you follow, right, or yourself as a human being that subscribes to, right. So obviously that's something places look for, right, regardless if they're director or not, just people in general, right, like to see consistency and activity. Yeah, so that's pretty much it, so um yeah, so totally go for it. Again, I would say, chill subs and duotrope and submission grinder are good places to start, and yeah. So yeah, again, chill subs is absolutely one I would recommend, getting a listing on. And again, they don't do a vetting process or verification process per se to date as of 2026 or anything like that. To my knowledge, right? And yeah, so they don't again do any verified process or any vetting right over a publication. Just because you're on chill subs doesn't again mean that you're a publication that is running smoothly and people should submit to you, right? There have totally been publications others have flagged, right, and notified others, right, that were operating pretty fishy or weren't where there are publications out there that absolutely again are just money grabbers, right, that care more about your submission fees and the money attached to your submission rather than your actual submission. And that sucks, right? And that's why it's great to have reviews, ratings for the community to report things and to share those things, right, in databases, right? Not every database has that, obviously, again, but yeah, great features added to chill subs, absolutely. And yeah, so yeah, don't be afraid to apply to places. That's how you learn, like, what they're looking for. Even I got rejected from like some library account places, and I found alternatives to them. So it's not like you're never can get into any of these directories or even places you want to get into. There's typically always an alternative place, right, or another place, right, to get into. At least one maybe out there, right? So don't feel bummed that maybe like one place says no or two places even, right? um Typically, the ones that pop in my search results a lot, right, are again chill subs, duotrope, clmp, right? And whether you become a CLMP member or not, that's up to you. You don't need to become a member of CLMP to be deemed as a legitimate you don't need to be part of CLMP to be deemed as a legitimate publisher, right? Even if you're not listed on chill subs, that doesn't mean you're not a legitimate publisher. But typically, if you were, considering how much traffic chill subs gets, you know um you would probably be found on chill subs, right, if a lot of people are aware of your publication, or have if quite a few people are aware of your publication or love it, right, or it has good operations, right? Typically others would probably make a suggested listing, or maybe they want to report something on a publication, or leave a review or rating of it, right? That could also mean, right, that's why it's listed on chill subs, because someone was compelled enough to give feedback on it, whether it's good or bad, I don't know. Hopefully it's good. But yeah. Anyways, so I hope that's helpful. I know this was a super long episode and I was talking through it, but yeah. So again, just read criteria carefully, and yeah, so there's no like every place isn't saying you have to wait 2-3 years to apply to these again or anything like that. It's again going to come down to, for some of these places, what's your schedule like, how many issues are you releasing a year, and are you sticking to your word, right, when you're releasing things, or being communicative at least if things are behind, and yeah, again, if you're inactive, if you're not consistent, right, these places are going to mark you as defunct, inactive, and you're not going to be listed in there anymore. But if you can return to your publication, if choose to, you know whoever may be listening to this, obviously, yeah, obviously if you become an active publication again, the places would relist you, obviously. So yeah, it just really helps others again with discoverability. So again, just because you're not listed, just because you don't get on a list or aren't in databases doesn't mean you're not a good publication, right? um it just, again, is a good idea to get listed, right, because then others can leave feedback, reviews, others can find you maybe a little bit more easily, right? The filtering was great on chill subs, right? Other databases, right, duotrope is a really great place as well. Other directories, right, the more directories, the more search results, right, others are probably going to find you through, right? Online doing quick searches, right? So yeah, so um, don't feel like you have to wait for anyone's stamp of approval again that you're a lit manager or press. The moment you release an issue, put out your first publication, that's technically, have your, you have all your guidelines, everything laid out, your website, that's technically when you're, officially a lit mag journal press. However, some of these directories and databases, they have some, minimum requirements, right, that you must meet in order to get a listing, right? And it varies slightly. So you just want to be mindful about that. I just wanted to cover this since it came up, and yeah. So absolutely, there are some lit magazine journals and presses out there that have negative reviews and get negative reports, or we've been aware of, right, through community reports and sharing. Lit Mag News has reported fishy behavior and things of that nature, right? So it's consistency is really important. I think even with Lit Mag News, like with interviews and stuff, if I recall right, you have to be right with Becky interviews places that are at least 3 years old, if I recall, right? Uh, I could be wrong on that, but yeah, things like that. So, you know, every place has some sort of like, obviously obviously the longer a publication is, active and running consistent, right? That looks better, right? Than one that is maybe inconsistent or not publishing regularly. With Deputy Lit Mag, I just restructured like the amount of print issues we do because it's just I had a lot of back to back life events and stuff. Even just recently, some things came up again. So I'll talk more about things I did with my Lit Mag journal this year, and it was a little bit more of a slower year, absolutely, at my Lit Mag and journal, and there were a number of factors behind that. But absolutely, catching up and absolutely. Sometimes when you have life events and stuff, you have to restructure things. You just have to, there's no way around that. You just, and then try to resume things as normal, or restructure your schedule, around your, restructure your schedule for your Lit Manager journal, right? If you want to keep it going, and just communicate that, right? So, yeah. So I hope this helps you. I know it's super, super long answer, but yeah, there's each place has again their FAQ pages listing criteria for publishing projects, that you'll come across. New Pages has theirs, poets and writers. So I didn't read through all of it because it's quite a bit, but yeah. Um, but yeah, and just make sure, when you get listed in a place that you maintain your listings, right? When you get approved or a listing is plugged in, yeah. So just because again a place approves you for a listing, right? Sometimes it takes community reporting and things of that nature for others to, you know, um have a listing no longer be, there, right? Yeah. So again, if a place has poor running operations, right, obviously it shouldn't be listed, right? So that's the only thing, so as long as you're publishing regularly, typically, that's a commonality across these directories typically, and have a set schedule, right? That's great, you're active, so yeah. They again, have even on Duotrope here, right? A note about third party submission managers. They state while they prefer guidelines posted directly on the official website, they do also accept guidelines posted on your own submission manager, right? Duosuma, as well as Submittable, Green Submissions, Moksha. No other third party submission managers or form builders are approved. Google Forms, Jotform, Cognitive Forms, Airtable, Ola, and Sofillo do not meet their technical requirements and cannot be approved. So keep that in mind. I think that's something, where you would just want to, again, it just helps to have your guidelines posted directly on your website, in full. And yeah, not just in your, submission management system. So if you use one, and I've covered most of these on the podcast, there are some I haven't, but absolutely, there's even some new ones I heard, or one or two coming out again, some other submission man systems. So maybe I'll cover them on the podcast and stuff. So yeah, I'm not familiar with green submissions, but the others I am, I've covered again some of these on the podcast, quite a few of them, but yeah, so just read through the guidelines. Again, I would just recommend posting your guidelines in full on your website, and then, of course, you can plug them in, in each bucket call if you're using a submission man system. If not, right, if you're using email, right, for to intake submissions or forms, right, then you have to adjust things accordingly to fit that, right? Put reminders on your website, have things in bold that need to be bolded, right? And yeah, so yeah, yeah, and again, pages on social networks such as Facebook, right, do not qualify as official websites. Crowdfunding sites, etc., right? They have specifications here, right? However, right, websites hosted on blogging platforms such as WordPress do qualify, right? So that could be like a Substack, even, right? Too, right? And yeah, so yeah, just Yeah, so yeah, again, websites hosted on blogging. So yeah, again, websites hosted on blogging platforms such as WordPress do qualify. And yeah, again, if you have any questions about criteria or something's unclear or you just want to confirm something before applying for a listing, yeah, you could reach out and contact. Every place has a contact address, right? So you could ask a question. But typically, if you feel like you check all the boxes off their criteria and meet that, absolutely, go ahead and apply. And they'll obviously tell you, hey, we couldn't find this, or just add this. With Duotrope, like for example, when I started Deputy Press, it was just a matter of like adding our guidelines also on the website because they couldn't, retrieve it from, where we had it, on our submission manager. And that's it. And, we had met the requirements for that. And yeah, again, I might restructure some things with both, not just my lit my and journal, but my press, release times and stuff. Just because of, family health events and stuff. But yeah, so I hope that answers your questions and I hope it was helpful. So, my advice again would be, apply to as many places as possible. You can learn from that, the rejections you get too as a learning experience as a founding editor. But, if you read ahead of time and read the criterion guidelines, of what they're looking for, right? It can be beneficial ahead of time, right? Then, you know, um, if they decline you, you can be like, hey, I thought we met all the requirements and guidelines. Could you tell me what we're missing? Why are we getting declined? Totally, it doesn't hurt to ask that, to figure out what you're missing. Sometimes they'll outright tell you, why you didn't get approved for a listing, right? Or in a place. I'm not too familiar with a bunch of curation places on Substack to my knowledge, but again, I just stated some ways you could get maybe noticed by one, and yeah, so it definitely helps to engage with others on Substack and to comment and to interact with others, but don't do spammy things because you can get your account, flagged and things, right? Even the notes section. You just want to be mindful about that, right? Don't be spammy and a marketer, on other people's publications. That's not appropriate. But yeah, it doesn't hurt to recommend others, to plug them into maybe again, hey, this is a list of places I really love that really and maybe share little bits about them and, in a post somewhere and tag them. It doesn't hurt, to do that even on social media. If you, say, hey, these are list places I really love, and tag them and maybe they'll see it, and could lead to a conversation or something. And, who knows? So yeah. So yeah. That's basically it. So yeah, again, Chill Subs doesn't have like, you know, um, like a whole very it's not like a whole vetting process like deep dive or anything like that to my knowledge on the back end. Obviously if there's any fishy or weird stuff going on, right, others can leave reviews, report it, and it would obviously be addressed, right? you know Obviously if a lit manager on press has really bad operations, right, typically it should be closed down, right? So yeah, there are actually some lit magazine journals and presses out there that feel more so that I think some writers feel like they're just out for it for the money, and it doesn't feel right, when others leave you hanging or you don't get a response from others, right? So yeah, just be transparent, communicative, and adjust your schedule accordingly if you have to with life events. But yeah, consistency, consistency, consistency. That's what it's important, right, when you're running a publication or series, right? Yeah, but absolutely, sometimes publications do pause and resume things. Some publications have come back after decades, totally, or years. So it's yeah, it's you just, again, do what you can, as I said in my guidebook. So yeah. Yeah, so again, if you want to pick up my guidebook, right, it's the make sure it's the large text print edition if you want to. Don't feel like you have to, but I put all my notes in there and plugged in. It follows the podcast, as well. Really corresponds to episodes to check out and list platforms and things to consider as a starting point for you. Reminders, key reminders, and things of that nature. But I know some people, the day they create their lit mag journal, their guidelines, everything, they apply to places. But you don't want to, again, jump the gun too early on things, right? You want to read carefully the criteria that others are looking for, if there's any visible. And yeah, again, it helps really to take the time to look at examples, other listings, other publications. And yeah, so you don't need to be 5 issues in, 4 issues in necessarily. But I think I felt comfortable reaching out to distributors more so, again, digital subscription platforms at issue 4, right, at that point, and reaching out to other organizations and things of that nature at that point. When you can demonstrate, yeah, you release 2 issues a year. But for directories and listings, others for just discoverability purposes, the earlier the better. But 6 months in, that's not a bad, 6 7 months in, that's not a bad point. And if you have 2 issues out, that's great. If you have an issue out, that's great. Absolutely. Every lit mag journal press has a slightly different schedule structure, right? Obviously, but it's important that whatever they have on their site, or is communicating to submitters and others, right, contributors, right, that it is followed through with. Updates are provided, so that's absolutely important. Um, yeah, so I know, very very long episode, but I wanted to talk through it. It just helps me talking through things, and visiting sites and sharing examples on screen. So yeah, so if you're listening to this episode and you just started Lit Mag Journal Press, right? Definitely. So, don't forget, to, ensure that you get listed in as many places as possible. If a place says no, a place says no. It doesn't necessarily mean you can never reapply to a place again, unless they're telling you you're completely ineligible because you're structured a certain way. Obviously you could restructure Lit Mag Journal Press, if possible, but don't feel like you're not a Lit Mag Journal Press just because you're not on some of these directories, right? If you're doing a good job, and running it the best you can, in accordance with your own personal schedule, right? Not every single publisher, again, not every single publisher in existence is on all these directories, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad publication, right? Um, yeah, so it's just a matter of certain criteria and things of that nature, right? But yeah, there are tons of lit mags and journals pressing on chill subs, and it comes down again to others leaving reviews, reporting things, and ratings, right? Um, and in general, right, over these publications. Same thing with Duotrope, right? Duotrope's team does annual checks and things of that nature. And they have advice for editors and common pitfalls to avoid. Advice for editors. So take some time to read that, and the reminders they have, right? Um, Again, something they have some great tips here on Duotrope, right? Their advice for editors, right? Um, you need to get, not enough people know about the project, not enough people know what you're doing, right? Have your mission statement visible, again, all of that, right? That's so important, right? CLMP says that as well when you apply, right? you know um Reminders, right? You have to have your mission statement visible. You have to have having a clean website, right? Professional, right? Tip jars are fine, and things like that, but obviously, not charging fees is more attractive to others, right? Things of that nature, right? And there are other things I mentioned, right, in my guidebook on things to not do, right? That are, that turn off, submitters, or, make them not want to submit to publication, and things like that. So yeah, so yeah, and yeah, so in Duotrope's case, right, they state, right, there's a misconception that Duotrope listings need cover images for the biggest impact, but that's not necessarily true. So don't fret, right, about the placeholder image they said. But yeah, it's nice to have a cover or some representation, of your uh, you know, typically Duotrope will just do like a screenshot of your where the main online publication is, if you don't have cover images. And chill subs, they let you plug in a visual or something that is resemblant of a cover that represents your publication, right? So that's great. I know not all places do that, and it's not absolutely necessary, but to have that. But I think having a cover image looks better than like a profile photo of someone running the publication. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's basically it. So take some time, guys. If you just started your Litman Journal Press, check out some of these directories and listings. I'll plug in links to all the ones I mentioned. You can find these also in my guidebook. There are probably going to be some more directories created in the next who knows 5 to 10 years, right? Over time for sure. More directories, more databases. The more the merrier. The more resources for others to find places, the better. There's also one for Canadian lit mags that popped up. I think I mentioned in my guidebook as well, and some other ones, for sure out there, in terms of databases and directories. So, yeah. Um, that's pretty much it. So take care, guys. I hope this episode helped. And I'll be covering another question probably next episode, or a platform of some sort, and resuming some episodes now. Again, if you want to support this series, totally, you could, support my Patreon. It's in the link in my bio. You could grab my guidebook, a PDF of it, or the print version, paperback or hardcover, the large print text edition. Just make sure, if you get the small print, it's not like, again, it's not readable, but it's really hard on the eyes, really, really hard. So I left the small print text edition up because it's not like, it's still, readable, but it's harder. So I didn't want to take that listing down because I'd worked quite a bit on the small text version. But, it helps to have two different versions, I think. One that's easier to read and one that's, perhaps, smaller in size a little bit, and yeah. Anyways, if you want a PDF for keeps, totally you can download it too. All the links are in the upper portion of my link in bio. And yeah. So again, none of these episodes are sponsored, but sometimes I have to mark some of them like that. And I don't know. Um, might add some links and some other things in the description for you guys to check out sometimes, and yeah, I just try to do as many helpful episodes as possible. Comment below. I know sometimes I can be long-winded, but I just like to be as detailed and thorough as possible and talk through things. So yeah, and I hope I answered your question, Liana. And yeah, guys, be sure to check out, if you're listening to this, The Good Companion sometime. Again, really helps, once places get plugged in directories, it makes them much easier to find for sure. So yeah, chill subs, I think, was the first directory I ever got listed in again. And then it was, I think I didn't go to Duotrope secondly. I think it was actually CLMP, then Duotrope. But again, you don't need to become a member of CLMP to be deemed as a Litmag Journal Press, right? That's not going to make you. There's nothing to say you're a certified Litmag Journal Press in the world, right? What it comes down to is, again, your operations, your publication consistency and all of that, right? And obviously, again, um, the more others are aware about your publication series, what you're doing, um, others are bound to make a suggested listing anyway, and it's a good idea as an editor to maintain your listings and directories to make sure everything's accurate wherever you may be listed or others are suggesting you, right? And P.S. guys, so I just want to reiterate one thing at the end. I know this is nearly 2 hours long or something, but just because you're listed in these directories, right? That alone isn't enough for others to really be able to discover you enough, right? You still have to, what I mean by that is do marketing around your Lit Mag Journal Press, right? Um, you know, traditional word of mouth may work, but a lot of people search online, a lot of people do use social media, not everyone. But yeah, if you're not huge on social media, it still helps to, have those accounts created, right? Obviously, and to maybe communicate updates there. If you don't want to post heavily to social media, you don't have to, but it's nice for others to have some sort of place to stay informed, right? Whether that be a newsletter or mailing list is so important again. But yeah, a lot of lit mags and journals and presses, and I mentioned my guidebook, right, still, wind up doing, those boost posts ads, right, on social media, right? They see on Instagram and stories, those ads that appear, right? Even a lot of artists in the industry have to use ads and things, for others to check out their music, right? Things of that nature, right? So yeah, just getting listed in these directories alone sometimes won't drive, that amount of traffic, that, a lot of traffic per se, um, you still have to do some marketing around it. Now, again, some submission man systems have those discover, pages I talked about on this podcast, right? And yeah, eventually, a lot of traffic does go through there's, the more publications that are on, some of those platforms, right? As I shared in some of these episodes, right? We noticed, my team and I, we noticed, a dip, right, when we switched submission managed platforms because we went to a newer one that just came out, right? As mentioned, a slight dip in volume and traffic, right? But it takes time to build that back up. Anytime you move like your submission management system or the space where others, submit, we're used to submitting, right? But yeah, so yeah, your marketing, right, um it is going to be a factor in this, right? And sometimes, yeah, some places had to do, ads, and stuff, and things of that nature. The success rate on those isn't always guaranteed, but it helps to, post as much as possible when you have open calls, to share that in many places possible on your channels, and yeah, it definitely takes time to grow, right? Anything, in life, right? And anything to start. So also, guys, aside from, directory, database, platforms like chill subs, duotrope, right, and getting listings there, even, there are other, right, curators, right, as I mentioned, right, not just on Substack, but like blog sites, even Medium. There are some I mentioned in an article, right, in the section of my Substack and elsewhere in my guidebook, right, discussing some of those blogs and list sites, other places that maintain lists, that others, check out, right, writers, submitters, and some of those places have like contact, forums and stuff. Even some literary magazines themselves, maintain a list, a support list, community support list of fellow lit mags, journals, and presses, that have submission calls. Some are all year round, some are open at certain times, right? Everyone is a little bit different structure with their lit mag journal press, right? Another thing I'm just going to tack on. So, again, aside from, chill subs and having a listing on there, right? This is mine, right? Lit mag, Dippy Lit Mag. And yeah, so um, there are also, other places, I shared on Substack, right, that you could post calls or make others aware of your publication. Totally. There's a couple different Facebook groups out there. This one has 25,000 members, right? There's another one that has, 40,000 members or something, Facebook like call for submission groups. There are not just one, but there's a, I think, a couple out there, right? I've come across at least two groups and stuff. So yeah, I haven't joined this one. There's another one with 40,000 members, so I'm not on both of them. But if you search call for submissions, lit mags, journals, and presses on right here on search results, you can see there's one that's 25,000 followers on it. There's a Facebook call for submissions, right? This one is probably one of the largest ones, right? 44,000 followers on it, right? Just others are posting, calls and yeah. And you can see, submission calls here, right? That editors have posted. Just follow the guidelines, wherever you're posting. they'll obviously take it down if you don't follow the guidelines, and aren't transparent about everything. So just look at some examples and, make sure that, if you're in compliance with any channel posts, or group post guidelines, wherever you may be posting. Again, groups and things of that nature, right, have criteria and things, they're, guidelines for that. Reddit is another place. This is a post I made a month ago, and now I've had to put, just messages that, on open signs and stuff, that it's not reiterate that it's not AI, right? This, for example, is a photographic digital collage, right? So that's not AI, right? Because I was getting a lot of comments like that. So, I just wanted to label our signage like that going forward, just to, you know, um, have that stop, because when you work on something, designing a sign or something, or any graphic, even illustrators, it's tough, for people to say, oh, that must be AI, right? It's not. So, anyways, yeah, so this is a Reddit channel I posted to, you can see, right? And others have posted to this Reddit channel. And so there are quite a few Reddit channels out there where you can post calls for submissions. Not all of them. Just read the guidelines and see what's allowed and what's not, in terms of, calls and posting. So this is one channel, right? Litmag's Reddit channel. And there are other ones out there I mentioned and shared in the series, on some articles and my guidebook and things. So yeah, totally, you can do some searching. You'll come across them keywords with lit mags, right? And you can, post to those, and they'll again decline you if you didn't follow their group guidelines and stuff, or just if you follow their guidelines and everything, on Reddit and wherever you may be posting, right? Should be no issue again. So aside from directories, to get traffic on, submission traffic and stuff on, your publication, right? Always a good idea to, post in as many places possible. Don't just rely on directories, right? Again, you have to do, there's some, need for marketing and sharing your calls a bit further, right? To really um, drive traffic to, your windows and make others aware. And there are a lot of free methods, so don't feel like you have to, do like advertisements or do that Instagram boost thing. But other late nights or journals, I do see they do ad placements and stuff of that nature on social media, right? And um, yeah, but a lot of the times you can, resort to free methods of, like, advertising your submission calls and sharing those out. So I always say exhaust all the free options as much as possible, and then, if you really need to, yeah, you could try out, running an ad, a social media ad of some kind, but ads marketing can get expensive and costly, right? So you don't want to do that. A lot of litmags have done fine, just, um, posting and free areas and spaces. And there are a lot of others out there who do a lot of awesome curated lists, or maintain sites, and they have, again, guidelines or criteria. Sometimes, there are places where others, are not the case, where you reach out to someone. It's more so they become aware of you, right? And then they maybe include you in their list, or, things of that nature. But, you know, yeah, so anyways, I just wanted to cover that. I just wanted to tack that on towards the end. I'm sure there'll be more directories in the future, right? Of places that, where others can plug in their lit mag or journal, right? Chill subs is a main one, obviously. And yeah, there's bound to be more databases over the next couple of years, and directories, and, different things for lit mags and journals and presses, right? Lit mags and journals are being created as I speak, right? And presses. So, it's a very, thriving community. I wouldn't say lit mags and journals are dying. Every year, there are, publications that face closure or become defunct. It's just bound to happen. But, as I stated, elsewhere, right, and multiple times in this podcast, right, do what you can. And yeah, I have the Canadian one up here too. So this is fairly new, I think. The Directory of Literary Magazines in Canada. So this one is one I check out sometimes. Now, there aren't a ton of literary magazines out there based in Canada that accept, submissions from those outside of Canada, but there are absolutely some windows where they allow international submissions for some of these, not all. So it is a nice site. I'll just plug in links to the ones I talked about again. But, again, totally, if you want to pick up my guidebook, you want to support this series, support, my Patreon. It's under my pen name, So you can find me on there, Vevna Forrow. So my anyways, yeah. So thanks so much. I've been following the series and subscribing to it. I really hope you took something away from it. If you guys have a question, totally drop a comment. No guarantees again that I'll see it. I haven't been getting for some reason notifications on comments, guys. I'm sorry. I don't know what it is. I was trying to figure out why. But the only reason I saw that comment or came across it because I noticed the comment count change. I was like, oh, where's this comment? Like, why can't I find it? And then I just was digging through some of the, you know, other episodes, older ones, and the ones that had more views on them than the most viewed episodes. And I'd come across a comment and I was like, oh, I didn't even get a email about that comment or anything, no messages at all that I could find whatsoever. So it's something buggy, perhaps with, YouTube. But, there are other places you could message me and stuff. Some have sent me an email. Totally, you're welcome to. Just no guarantees again, that I'll answer your question, but dropping a comment's fine. Others have sent me messages directly on Substack too. And yeah, so if you have a question, I do try to answer it, but again, no guarantees. I just do these when I can. And thanks so much for following, subscribing, or supporting the series. And if you pick up my guidebook, don't forget the larger print text edition subtitle because I just heard back from support that support ticket I did, and they said it's going to be resolved within 7 days with the linkage. But so just keep that in mind while that's being addressed, like within this week. And yeah, so everything will link up correctly, and that small text edition shouldn't be linked up at all to my ebook version. So just make sure when you're ordering it's if you do the large text print edition, right, look for that in the subtitle very carefully. And yeah, so take care, guys, and see you in the next episode. Yeah, I'll probably cover some lit magazine journals, some platforms that I want to talk about a little bit, variety of episodes, right? Again, this series is both for founding editors and submitters, and yeah, so others have said this series has helped them and they took something away from it, so that's awesome. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I just pulled up the Dippity Lit Mag duo trip listing. So yeah, I was mentioning the frequency changes of my own lit mag and journal, right? And you can see here what Duotrope does when, you don't perhaps have a, visible publication frequency that they can see or anything like that. They'll just put unknown publication frequency. Or if it's in the midst of changing, or being restructured, right, that may be something they do too. And again, love that they put the right policy there, right, human created work only. And yeah, and again, they typically go off of what's visible on your website, the guidelines and everything. So eventually, yes, it is a good idea for me to plug into the website a set schedule of some sort, after things settle down a little bit. We'll see how things go, with my lit mag. So, uh, yeah, that's all. And thanks so much for subscribing again. And yeah, see you again in the next episode. Yeah.